Off we go.
All right, well, thank you guys. We'll keep this pretty informal since it's a small group, and appreciate the opportunity. I always start off by saying when I'm somewhere that I consider this local, it's nice that I don't have to fly because I don't have to get the good old-fashioned TSA sexual assault, so that's always good. And it's nice talking to a group of libertarians because I can be a little bit more loosey-goosey with my own personal political philosophy as opposed to speaking at like the Republican group or something like that. You know, gotta be a little more careful there. So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm just going to talk a little bit tonight about why I do what I do at the 10th Amendment Center, why it's important, and really focusing on the concept of decentralization. How many of you are familiar with the 10th Amendment Center? So pretty much everybody has some idea of what we do. We're a national organization. We're based in Los Angeles, California, and pretty much can sum up our core philosophy in one sentence. We say follow the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses. That's what we do. Very simple. Now, a lot of people will say, well, isn't that a little bit, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, it's a little too stringent. A little too stringent, a little too emphatic, you know. And I say, okay, well, the Constitution is basically a contract, right? So if I say that the bank has to honor the terms of my mortgage, am I being too stringent? You know, so I don't think it is being too stringent. This is the basis of what is supposed to be the United States government, and if we're going to have it, then it should be followed, and it should be followed as it was intended. I think that's pretty reasonable. Now, that brings up a more fundamental issue, though. Why? I mean, why bother with the Constitution? Why is it important? And to me, it's important because it is a structure of government that emphasizes decentralization. It is a decentralized system. It is a decentralizing document. And it is my opinion that centralized power is the gravest threat to liberty. So that's one of my most fundamental cores. If we're going to have government power, it needs to be diffused and decentralized throughout a system. The more it's concentrated, the more dangerous it becomes, and the more destructive to liberty it becomes. And I use this analogy a lot. It's like a monopoly. And I was joking with somebody that I saw this meme today, and it was it had this whole big. It was supposed to be a comedian, okay, but he really wasn't funny. It was about the game Monopoly, and he was going on and on about how, you know, we're teaching our kids that Monopoly is good, monopolies are awful, and, you know, it's this whole anti-capitalist, socialist rant about how bad monopolies is. And I just said, government's a monopoly. Checkmate. You know, people don't seem to understand, especially the system that we've evolved into in the United States is becoming very much a monopoly system with all the power in Washington, D.C. and very little authority anyplace else. And if this was going on in the world of business, everybody would throw a fit. Okay, if suddenly I got to be Lord and Master of the universe, which is not a good plan, but let's just pretend I get to be Lord and Master of the universe, and I come in and I say, you know what? I think it would be great if Walmart would be the sole supplier of groceries. Because it's going to be great, you know, because it'll be streamlined and it'll be efficient, and we won't have all of this, you know, won't have to go here for meat and over here for vegetables. You go one place, everything will be. Nobody would buy that. Everybody would be like, oh, it'd be awful. You know, they would say that prices would go up and there'd be no competition and it would be horrible service, and all of that's true. Well, ladies and gentlemen, government's no different. When you centralize authority in one place, you create a monopoly, you get all of the nasty things you would get if Walmart was running groceries. Unfortunately, we have this situation where basically Washington, D.C. is running our lives. I mean, it's literally to the point that the federal government determines how much water is in your toilet and what kind of light bulbs you can screw into your fixtures. So that seems to me pretty darn intrusive. So I'm opposed to monopoly, I'm opposed to centralization, and since I'm here among libertarians, I'm going to throw a Hans Hermann Hoppe quote out at you, because Hoppe happens to agree with the importance of decentralizing systems. Back in the 90s, he did a speech, and he actually talked about, he laid out his plan a practical plan for liberty, and he talked about the importance of decentralization. And he said, because a monopoly of protection is the root of all evil, any territorial expansion of such a monopoly is per se evil too. Every political centralization must be on principle grounds rejected. In turn, every attempt at political decentralization must be supported. I agree wholeheartedly with Hoppe on this point. We need to decentralize the system, and so that's why I do what I do at the 10th Amendment Center, because like I said, the Constitution is a decentralizing document. Now I'm going to give you the like 45-second crash course in the Constitution just because this is what I do, and I enjoy it. A lot of people are under the misunderstanding that during the ratification of the Constitution you had a group of people that we called the Federalists that were for centralized power, and we had a group of people called the Anti-Federalists that were against centralized power. And that's not really the case. The truth of the matter was that by the time we got to ratification, everybody agreed that it was going to be a decentralized system with a federal government with very limited authority. The debate was, would this Constitution create that system? Everybody, not everybody, but the majority of people wanted a decentralized system. And the argument was, will this Constitution create that system? And the Anti-Federalists were saying, no, 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 there's some loopholes in this thing that you can drive a horse and buggy through. And then there were the Federalists that were saying, no, 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 these things mean this. This is limited, and that's the basis that we're ratifying it on. So that was really the debate. Now it's interesting if you go back to the Philadelphia Convention when they were actually drafting the Constitution, because there was a strong push for a centralized national government. Alexander Hamilton probably being the most prominent nationalist, because he embraced that position his entire life. He basically lied his way through the ratification and then completely flipped his story once in power. But even James Madison, who we tend to think of as being a great federalist and a great decentralizer and a great protector of limited government, even Madison, during the drafting of the Constitution, wanted a more centralized system than we've got. He actually proposed on 2 occasions having a veto over all state laws, that the federal government would be able to veto any state law, and that was rejected. So by the time the Constitution made its way through this convention, by the time it was brought to the people for ratification, we had a Constitution that created a more centralized government than we had under the Articles of Confederation, but certainly very, very limited in scope. And we can see this through the ratification debates. And to me, the ratification debates are the key to understanding what the Constitution means. And in fact, that's what Madison said. That's what Thomas Jefferson said. This was the basis that the people accepted the document. These were the promises that were given, that people said, okay, we're going to accept this and embrace it. So we look at things like the Federalist Papers, for instance. And quite frankly, I don't think the Federalist Papers are actually the best source, but that's the best known source because mainly I think because of the authors. And they actually had very limited influence during the ratification debates. They were printed in New York primarily, got very little circulation outside. But they give us a good sense of what the Federalist arguments were. And one of my favorite is Federalist 45. And that's where James Madison explained very briefly what the structure of the federal government was going to be. And he said, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. And he said the powers which remain to the states and the people are numerous and indefinite. So we had a centralized government with few defined powers and states and people maintaining basically infinite powers. And he went on and he said that the powers that the federal government would exercise would primarily have to do with national defense, foreign trade, or what were often called external objects. Things that the states were banding together and working out in the international scene. He said everything that has to do with the life, liberty, and prosperity of the states and the people would remain with the states and the people. So when the federal government starts meddling in things like health care, or environmental concerns, or education, or your toilet water, 99% of what the federal government is doing does not fall within these few defined limited powers that James Madison was talking about. But like I said, I don't think the Federalist Papers are the most important source. I think the ratification debates are the most important source. And being somewhat of a nerd, I've read a lot of the ratification debates, and I can assure you that time and time again, supporters of the Constitution were saying, this is limited. This means limited. General welfare only means the enumerated powers. You know, all of this stuff was said over and over again, and that was the basis upon which the Constitution was ratified. And it's really interesting because when you look at the ratification documents that were issued by the states, several of them very explicitly talk about the limits of federal power. It was kind of, this is how we understand what we're ratifying. And one of my favorite is actually the state of New York. And there's a clause in there that says this: we're ratifying this on the basis that the powers of government may be reassumed by the people, whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness, in other words, secession, that every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to Congress of the United States or to the departments of the general government thereof remains to the people and to the several states or to their respective state governments to whom they may have granted the same. So this is a ratification document. This is even before the 10th Amendment was even considered and ratified. It's very, very clear that the people expected to get a limited general government. And of course, what do we have? We have the behemoth in Washington, D.C. that we have today. And this is, in my opinion, not a good thing. And I think it's a lot of the problems that we have in the world today have to do with the fact that the federal government far oversees its authority in so many different levels. But as I said, despite this design, the fact of the matter is, and the reason we've gotten to where we are today, is that the truth of the matter is most people do not want decentralized government. Most people want limited government as long as it's doing all the things they want it to do. Even progressives want limited government in certain spheres. And conservatives talk a lot about limited government, but you know, when you start talking about drug wars and imperialism across the world, that limited government thing gets thrown out the window.
Healthcare.
Healthcare. And here's where I'm going to start stepping on some toes a little bit. Even libertarians get caught in this centralization. I call it the liberty centralizers, or libertarian centralizers. It's this mentality that we're going to use the power of the federal government to enforce liberty on the whole rest of the world. And it's true. I mean, you laugh, but this is a very strong mentality. One of the things that I say on a regular basis that makes people madder than anything in the world is when I tell them the Second Amendment has nothing to do with state governments. People throw a fit. Oh, well, what do you mean? The Second Amendment was right to keep and bear arms. No. The Bill of Rights was never intended to apply to state governments. Never was intended. There's no founding era evidence that it was intended. There is bajillions of tons of evidence that it was not. And I've heard all the arguments. I've heard all the legal people try to twist this and that in the Supremacy Clause. There is no founding era evidence. It was meant to restrain and farther restrict the powers of the federal government. The state constitutions and the bills of rights that are in the state constitutions were intended to limit those state governments. So for the most part, except for some people who want to play verbal gymnastics, for the most part, the incorporation of the Bill of Rights comes through the 14th Amendment. And people will say, well, that applied the Bill of Rights to the states, and that's where the courts have gone, in my opinion, absolutely crazy, basically using the power of the judiciary to legislate at the state and local level. And we could go into a whole big discussion about the 14th Amendment, and it's a fun discussion, but not for tonight. But I'm convinced, and I'm going to actually read this. This is a quote from me, but I'm going to read it because it's really good. I am convinced that the willingness to centralize the enforcement of rights at every level through the federal government via federal courts is the greatest long-term threat to the liberty movement. People are embracing centralized federal supremacy for a few scraps of freedom the powers that be throw to them. And I mentioned guns, and that's where we really see a lot of libertarians and a lot of conservatives. They want the Supreme Court to like, people love the idea of a federal national reciprocity for concealed carry. I think this is the most horrible idea in the whole world. First off, it's unconstitutional. You're centralizing power. Second off, when you do that, the federal government's going to get to make the rules for concealed carry for the entire United States. Now, if you live in California, that might be a good deal if you own guns, but probably for us in Kentucky, I doubt it. Yep. And therein lies the problem with centralized authority. It's one size fits all. It's enforcing one vision on everybody. And you end up in a situation where you have no place to go. And a really good example, not too long ago, there was a court case, I think it was in Maryland, and it was a local police issue, and they forced this guy to give up his DNA for a DNA database. Now, I think we would all agree that that's horrible. We don't want the police collecting DNA and putting them in a giant database. It's creepy and shouldn't happen. So this guy agreed that it was creepy and shouldn't happen. It's particularly not happened to him. So he sued in federal court, and lo and behold, the wise, as one of my friends called them, judicial temple monkeys, decided that it was perfectly okay for police to enforce or to collect DNA from you on an arrest and put it in a database. Now, if he had done what he should have done and sued in state court, and the state court made that decision, it would still be a horrible decision, but it would only apply to Maryland. But now we have a situation where every cop in the whole United States gets to go, hey, Supreme Court said I can collect your DNA. Here we go. So there's no place to go. There's no diffusion of power. There's no way that, if you live in Kentucky, this is a pretty good state for guns. If you like guns, come to Kentucky. Now, I'll be honest with you, as somebody who's very concerned about surveillance, really, honestly, a better place to live would be California. California's got great privacy laws and do a lot of great things in terms of trying to limit the surveillance state. So if you live in California and you want to own guns, you can at least leave, okay? When the federal government tells us that we're going to do something, there ain't no place to go. I mean, I guess you could leave the country, but it's not easy, and they're still going to tax you. So that's really the whole key to me, is this idea of political decentralization, of diffusing authority, of having competitive jurisdictions, because competition, as most of us free market people would agree, is good. It's good. It creates conflict. And when it comes to government, I want them conflicting with each other, not with me. So one of the main reasons that I'm so emphatic about this whole Bill of Rights and keeping things at this. Let me back up a second, because I want to address an argument that's often given to me. People say to me, Mike, are you telling me that the state of Kentucky can infringe on my rights? No, I never said that. That never came out of my mouth. What I am saying is that when the state of Kentucky infringes on your rights, you should work within the system of the state of Kentucky instead of running to Papa Fed and having Papa Fed try to enforce your will on the state of Kentucky. That's what I'm saying. And if you think about it in logical terms, what do you do when the federal government violates your rights? Do you run to the UN? Some people do. Some would. But most people are like, I don't think I want the UN. So instead of pretending like Washington, D.C. is the top of the pyramid, just pretend like Frankfurt's the top of the pyramid. And if you don't like what they're doing in Frankfurt, then work within that system instead of trying to use more centralized power to force liberty on the state of Kentucky. What you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with more authority up here and more bad garbage that's going on. So fast forwarding back to where I was a second ago, going back around. One of the reasons that I'm so emphatic about this constitutional structure is that the system that the founders created offers us a very strong tool to fight the centralized authority in Washington, D.C. But it's all contingent on this constitutional structure. It's all contingent on federalism. And this is the concept of nullification. How many of you have heard of nullification? How many of you love nullification? I love nullification. James Madison in Federalist 46 was addressing the question of what do we do when this federal government oversteps its bounds. We've created these limits. We're saying it's a limited government. What do we do? when the federal government oversteps. The problem is we've not done anything about it.
Right.
I mean, some people have gone to the Supreme Court, and I think this is just the most absurd strategy in the world. We're going to go to people who are employed by the federal government, who are part of the federal government, who are paid by the federal government, who have made their life's work working through the system of the federal government. We're going to get them to limit the federal government.
Yeah, totally ridiculous.
Yeah, not a good plan.
Police investigators.
The intention was for the states to limit the federal government. And James Madison actually gave us a blueprint in Federalist 46. He said, when the federal government commits an unwarrantable act, or he said, even a warrantable act, in other words, a constitutional act that just happens to be unpopular, he said that there is a means of opposition that is powerful and at hand. I love the way he put it. There's a means of opposition that is powerful and at hand. And he listed several things that states could do to resist federal authority. And he talked about governors, protesting, and he talked about legislative devices. But I think the key piece of information that he gave us was he said, we can resist federal authority by a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union.
Yes.
That right there is the fundamental concept of nullification. Refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. So how does this work? Well, here's how it works. Colorado says, you know what, we think that we should have legalized marijuana in our state. Federal government says, no, this is banned. Prohibition. We have complete prohibition. We're the federal government. By God, you will also ban. No, Colorado said, you know what, we're going to make marijuana legal in our state. That's nullification. Because the dirty little secret is the federal government does not have the resources or the personnel to enforce all of its laws, all of its edicts, all of its programs over the whole United States.
Right.
It depends on state and local governments to do virtually everything that it does. 90% of marijuana arrests are at the state level, state and local level. So when the state legalizes marijuana, it eliminates 90% of the enforcement. Well, that's not perfect, but that's pretty darn good. And if more states do it, it thins out the federal government even more. When Colorado actually, the week before recreational marijuana was supposed to go into effect in Colorado, the DEA decided that they were going to do a big raid. It was basically a big, we're gonna show you how tough we are. So they did this big raid, and they raided 12 medical marijuana dispensaries in the city of Denver, shut them down, made a big deal about it, called it a huge enforcement effort. Now, that sounds pretty impressive. They shut down 12 medical marijuana dispensaries. But do you know how many medical marijuana dispensaries there were in Denver, Colorado at the time? 400. 400. 400. They shut down 12. We actually ran the numbers. I don't have them in front of me. But basically, in order for the federal government, the DEA, to shut down all of the dispensaries in Denver, a single city in a single state, it would cost half of their yearly budget. So there you have the lack of resources. And we like to we pick on gun people a lot at the tip of it, because you know what? The weed people are gutsy. I mean, they started in 1996 in California, and they said, you know what, we're going to have medical marijuana. And the federal government said, oh, hell no, you're not. And they cracked down, and they enforced, and the people in California, they did it anyway. And then we had a Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court said, oh, hell no, you're not. And by that time, there was about 12 states that had medical marijuana. And it just kept growing because they didn't care. I wish the gun people would have that kind of guts.
Yes.
And the gun people, they're wanting to go to the Supreme Court. They got guns! But no, they're going to go to the Supreme Court. And they're going to get the judges, the federal employees. They're going to get them to do it. No, be like the weed people. Be like the immigration people. There's there was a protest in San Francisco not long ago. It was deport ICE.
Yes.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we have sanctuary cities for guns? Anyway, I'm bunny trailing a little bit. But that is not in Louisville, right?
Not in my
But that's nullification. It's a refusal to cooperate with officers' union. And part of the reason I like this so much is that first off, it's constitutionally legitimate. But second off, it teaches a good principle. Because I think personal nullification is a good thing. And here's how that works. People will tell me that, oh no, Mike, there's no way. You can't resist the federal. If the federal government really wanted to crack down on drugs, they would. Well, yeah, they can create pain for people. There's no doubt about that. But they can't enforce it. That's the thing. So 4th of July just went by. And Lexington a few years ago, in their infinite wisdom, decided that they were going to ban fireworks. So here's the rule in Lexington. If it goes up or blows up, it's illegal. Let me tell you. Starting about June 24th, things were going up and blowing up. 4th of July, for 4 hours, our neighbors next door blew stuff up. God love them.
America.
That's America.
Right.
Exactly.
That's America.
I've got a friend that works for one of the TV stations, and I actually had her do call the public information officer for the police department. Do you know how many citations that they wrote for illegal fireworks on the 4th of July? Exactly. Not one. No citations. She said, oh, we give warnings first.
No revenue generated?
No revenue generated. But how do you enforce that? You can't. Everybody's doing it. It's like the speed limit. You can't force the speed. You can, like I said, I'm not saying you can't cause pain for certain individuals. But overall, when enough people decide, you know what, we're not doing this, it's not getting done. And that works at any level of government. So that's what we do at the 10th Amendment Center. We try to find ways to refuse cooperation with officers of the Union, to roll back and hinder some of this federal power. So, practically speaking, let's take, we have the marijuana example, so we just try to, okay, how can we apply this model to anything else? So, you know, the TV just came on. The federal government decides it's going to ban a certain type of gun. Oh, we get prizes.
Oh, trivia.
I want a prize.
They actually offered us one of those speakers. Should have taken it.
I got a big mouth.
Yep. Good.
I'm about finished anyway.
Got 15 minutes.
So, anyway, so how do you apply this to other areas? So like guns. If a state was to say, and Idaho's actually done this, we are not going to enforce any future federal gun control. So, if they pass a gun control law in Idaho, federal ATF's going to have to do it themselves. We could effectively repeal and not replace Obamacare if enough states simply said, we're not going to help you implement this system. We're not going to run your stupid insurance exchange. We're not going to let our insurance commissioners enforce your stupid insurance rules. If somebody has a problem with their Obamacare coverage, they can call. There's nobody to call.
Right.
We could make that thing collapse with state and local efforts. We even figured out a way to fight the NSA using state and local action. And we were talking about this earlier. We mentioned Off Now. The Off Now project was actually, the brainchild was, how can we resist the NSA at the state and local level? Sounds impossible, right? No. The NSA uses state and local resources, specifically in Utah, water,
Exactly.
that is provided by the city of Bluffdale, which is a political subdivision of the state of Utah. The state of Utah has every right and every authority to say, you know what, we're not doing contracts with the NSA anymore. You figure out how to get your own water out of this desert. They actually did this in Nevada. They actually shut down the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Facility because the state of Nevada refused to issue the water permits for them to drill the wells to even begin exploring dumping nuclear waste in that mountain. And a federal judge, oh my gosh, actually ruled the right way. Because here's the beauty of this. This is not just some kind of, you know, a lot of times when you start talking about nullification, the first thing you should get called a racist.
Yeah.
Of course, that doesn't happen much anymore because now the progressives have suddenly figured out, oh my God, we have Donald Trump, so maybe we better fight this person. Exactly. But we used to get that, you're a racist. And then you would get supremacy clause, supremacy clause, supremacy clause, supremacy clause, supremacy clause. And I won't get into the legal technicalities, but they're always leaving the most important words out of the supremacy clause, which is in pursuance thereof. If it's not in pursuance of the Constitution, it's null and void. But the beauty of this is the Supreme Court, and you won't catch me, you've already gotten a sense of my general feeling about the Supreme Court. But in this case, they happen to have handed us a valuable tool, and I think they're right within the constitutional framework. They have created what is known as the anti-commandeering doctrine. The anti-commandeering doctrine, very simply, it's based on essentially 4 primary Supreme Court cases. And the federal government has consistently held that, or the Supreme Court is consistent, well, Supreme Court, federal government, same thing. They consistently held that the federal government cannot force a state or a locality to utilize its resources or its personnel to enforce a federal law. So, in other words, sanctuary cities, if they actually get that off the ground, if it goes to the courts, it is already established that the federal government cannot force the city of San Francisco to enforce federal immigration laws. Now they're not going to be able to physically block it. You know, you can't go and arrest an ICE agent, although that might not be a bad idea, arrest an ATF agent.
Fantastic idea.
And I think within the context of the Constitution as ratified, that's a legitimate role for the state. But where are you going to get the political backbone for that? But when it comes to just refusing to do things, the law is actually on our side. So we have this powerful tool. I am afraid that conservatives and others are going to undermine this because all of a sudden that their guy is in office, you know, they want to preserve the power of the federal government. And that's a very dangerous thing. That's why we say every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses. Because when you start trying to get the federal government to do what you want it to do, you're in effect empowering it to do whatever it wants. So, one final thing. I want to talk about one of my favorite figures in history, and that's Rosa Parks. Because Rosa Parks illustrated the power of nullification on her own with her single action. And you guys all know this story. You know, she's on the bus, and she's going home from work, and she actually sat down behind the little sign. They actually had a little sign in the bus that said, I can't remember what it said, I think it said whites only. And,
Whites only.
yeah. And so she was actually sitting in the right place, but the bus filled up. It was a rainy day. There's a lot of passengers. So the bus driver came, and he took the little sign, and he put it behind her. And there was actually 4 black people that were sitting in this little section, and 3 of them got up and moved, and she didn't get up. And she said, when he saw me sitting, this was from her autobiography, she said, when he saw me still sitting, he asked if I was going to stand up. And I said, no, I am not. And he said, well, if you don't stand up, I'm going to have to call the police and have you arrested. And I said, you may do that. I love it. I mean, she didn't throw a fit. She didn't break the windows out of the bus. You know, she didn't cuss the guy. She just said, no, I'm not getting up. And if you're going to call the police, do what you got to do. And they did call the police, and they arrested her. And she actually, I think they fined her like $10. And she ended up losing her job because she had been arrested. But that single action ignited a flame that literally obliterated Jim Crow. It started the Montgomery bus boycott. It started the whole rise of peaceful civil disobedience. And I love peaceful civil disobedience. And it's really interesting what she said. And I'm going to close with this. She said, people always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. She said, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me being old then. I was only 42. She said, no, the only tired I was tired of giving in. Powerful. And that's kind of the point that I got in my own life as a reformed neocon. And realizing that the power that government was exercising over me and was going to exercise over my children, and being a person that I just want to live free, man, just leave me alone. But until we get tired of giving in, the system is going to continue. And now I'm preaching to the choir because you guys are all people that are committed to resisting and committed to changing the system, and I appreciate that. And I just want to leave that as a word of encouragement. So, one more little piece of shot before I leave, because I forgot to do this. This is my shameless sales pitch. I do have a book, and these books are for sale. It's called Our Last Hope.